Plato and Aristotle were the first to characterize the order of nature as stratified. And this characterization has lasted into our time. Today we find it referred to by different names, such as the quantum ladder in physics, hierarchy theory in biology, systems theory and studies of artificial life and artificial intelligence, and systems philosophy. Mariano Artigas also thought about the natural order as structured in levels of organization. The problem is that different level structures have been proposed as descriptions of the order of nature, and thus testing this ontological notion for empirical adequacy is necessary, and this is what I propose to do in my paper. The intent is to build on Mariano's notion of levels, and to do this in the spirit of Karl Popper, admired by Mariano. Specifically, I share Popper's idea of metaphysics as, quote, particles suspended in a fluid. Testable science is the precipitation of these particles at the bottom of the vessel, unquote. As you can see, all of life is chemistry. Since order in nature is my focus, I will not consider aggregates, because in them entities, processes, and phenomena are not ordered. An aggregate is an assemblage or a collection of items not held together by bonds, and therefore lacks integrity and unity. In contrast, the components of a system are interrelated. The components can be either conceptual, as in a taxonomy, or concrete, as in a crystal. Level systems or hierarchies are conceptual systems, and despite talk about lower level initial conditions and upper level constraints, levels have no causal efficacy. Level systems are abstract representations of concrete systems, and my focus therefore will be on these concrete systems. So let me just give you an example of the distinction. At the bottom, sorry, at the top, you'll find some things that I will be talking about here. For instance, if you take the medium-sized triangle, that is a part of a larger triangle, and inside it has other parts that are parts of this triangle that can be considered as a whole. So when I talk about entities or wholes, that's the sort of thing I mean. At the bottom you find its representation in terms of levels of organization. Very simplistically, the largest triangle at the top, the progressively smaller ones at the bottom. So my focus will be on concrete systems and on the relationships between wholes and parts, as well as among wholes that characterize these systems. When I use the language of levels and hierarchies, I'm always referring to abstract representations of concrete systems. Hierarchies then are distinguished on the basis of the relation between the components of the system. My thesis is that there are two fundamental ways of cutting nature at its joints: the Constitutive Hierarchy and the Specification Hierarchy. These represent two different perspectives on the order of nature. My essay starts with a description of the constitutive order of wholes and parts, which you find listed here. Here you find different ways in which things can be related. A star can compose a galaxy. A molecule can compose or constitute an organism. So that's one of these relationships. In this particular case, the same kind of relationship can also be interpreted as a lineage in an evolutionary way. And then finally, there is a different kind of hierarchy, the so-called command hierarchy, in which there is an authority relationship between the commander and the soldiers, as it were. So those are just some examples of these kinds of relations that I will be talking about. This model then, the model of the specification hierarchy, is used to resolve various kinds of problems with level structures that are found in the literature. And so in a sense, my presentation is a cleaning up exercise in trying to create clarity and trying to make the point that there is actually a single perspective you can have on levels of organization, which deserves to be considered as an ontological reality. So this model then provides a rationale for reducing the panoply of hierarchies to the two just mentioned. And I will finish with some reflections on the religious aspects of hierarchy theory. The constitutive hierarchy first then, the question of the relationships between different kinds of entities or wholes and parts. Constitutive and specification hierarchies are two representations of whole-part relations that have dominated the practice of natural philosophers and natural scientists since Plato and Aristotle, though not always in pure form. Over the last half-century, the constitutive hierarchy has become increasingly prominent. Unlike a concrete aggregate in which entities are not related according to any particular kind of order, the entities of a concrete constitutive system have a definite order. Any given entity is both a whole and a part, as I just showed you with a triangle example. Further, there are qualitatively different ways in which parts can constitute a whole. This is one of the issues that I'm introducing as a relatively new one, because in the literature you find composition conceived mostly as spatial or physical composition, creating lots of confusion. So what I mean to say is, for instance, that atoms do not constitute molecules in the same way as cells constitute organisms. Pretty obvious. A description of the constitutive hierarchy then includes these different modes of constitution, such as physical constitution, biological constitution, and social constitution, etc. The specification hierarchy maps the same whole-part relations, but focuses on the qualitatively different ways in which wholes are constituted by their parts. And in this figure you find both perspectives represented. If you read this one from the left to the right, you find that you go from very small entities to progressively larger ones, let's say elementary particles, atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, populations, and then it continues here with the biosphere, let's say, and entities on an astronomical level. That is a typical composition way of looking at things. It doesn't take into consideration the different natures of things. If you read it from the top to the bottom, you'll find here the things that, the entities that function physically, the ones that function biologically, and then others that are not included in here that function in other ways, like cognitively and socially, etc. When the philosopher Bung, I think that's how you pronounce his name, uses a social system to introduce his definition of the composition of a system, he does distinguish social part-whole relations from biotic part-whole relations. He writes, and I quote, and here you can read along, "A social system is a set of socially linked animals. The brains of such a system are parts of the latter, but do not qualify as members or components of a social system because they do not enter independently into social relations. Only entire animals can hold social relations. In other words, the composition of a social system is not the collection of its parts, but just the set of its atoms, as he puts it." That's a little confusing, but what he means is that those are the real parts that are socially connectable, unquote. In distinguishing social from biotic systems, Bung introduces the notion that concrete wholes, including their parts, can function in fundamentally different modes. Thus he uses two different criteria for the characterization of a system: the criterion of composition as well as the criterion of mode of functioning, the capacity for social relations in this case. The proper representation of fundamental differences in mode of functioning is in the hierarchy of mode of functioning, which I'll refer to as the specification hierarchy. For now, I will focus further on the constitutive hierarchy. Generally, the key to being a part is to be strongly integrated in a whole. Let me see that I can explain with this overhead. If you take the previous example and imagine that the smallest box here represents the brain, the next larger one, the human being, and the next larger one, society, let's say, then the idea is that the human brain interacts strongly with the organism. It doesn't interact at all with society. And so that means then that the strong integration is limited to the brain and the organism, and it does not include the brain and society. It's true that social and cultural factors can shape neural development, but these influences are not direct between society and the brain. Rather, they are mediated by the organism. Likewise, a hydrogen atom, for instance, is part of a hydrogen molecule because the atom is strongly integrated in the molecule. When an isolated atom becomes a molecular atom, its charge distribution and line spectrum change. It is this changed atom that is strongly integrated in the molecule. In that sense, a molecular as opposed to an isolated atom is a part of a molecule. Thus, in the process of becoming a part, a whole acquires new properties, which I will refer to as parts properties. But it also retains properties it had as a whole. Similarly, just to give you some examples to get the drift of this idea, DNA, for instance, is part of a cell because it is integrated biologically in the cell, but DNA's atoms are not part of the cell. They are part of the DNA molecule because they are integrated in it, not in the cell. Likewise, a gene, closely related example, is a part of a cell but is not part of the organism of which that cell is a part. Final example, my cells are not parts of the population of which I am a part, even though they are parts of me. In sum, to be strongly integrated is to maintain direct relations. Strong integration now is guaranteed when a part is produced by a whole and cannot exist independently of the whole. This means that parts can be parts only of wholes that function in the same fundamental way as the parts. A whole cannot become a part of another whole of a qualitatively different kind. For instance, when chemical elements and compounds are used by cells to produce the nucleic acids DNA and RNA, they do not become parts of the cell, as I just said. Rather, they become parts of the nucleic acid with which they strongly interact by chemical bonding. So we can then define parts as follows. W stands for the whole and P for the part. So let's have a whole that has parts P1 through Pn. Then any kind of part is part of a whole if those three conditions are fulfilled. Can you see it in the back there? Barely, I'll read them. First of all, that the part and the whole function in the same mode. So examples for that is that atoms and molecules, for instance, function in a physical mode. Neurons in the brain both function in a biological mode, and people in society in a social mode. The second one here is that any particular kind of part is an insufficient condition for the existence and proper function of the whole, but together all the parts are jointly necessary and sufficient for the existence and proper function of the whole. And then finally, that the whole is necessary and sufficient for the existence of the part, which basically is another way of saying that the whole needs to produce the part. Now, to be a part is to be strongly integrated, as I said. And it is to maintain direct relations. This has a lot to do with the concept of scale, which is used by biologists. Whether entities interact directly or indirectly depends on differences in scale. The scale of an entity is the time or space over which it averages the influences it undergoes from other entities. Entities of similar size and mass complete their cycles of characteristic behavior in similar time intervals and can therefore interact directly. An example, a Brownian motion of a dust particle is caused by the random heat motion of molecules. Even though the size and mass of a dust particle is several orders of magnitude larger than that of molecules, the difference is not large enough to prevent causal interaction. Likewise, humans can hear sounds below 30,000 hertz, let's say, because the microscopic hairs on their auditory receptor cells can interact with the frequency of the sound waves below that level. But if size and mass differ by too many orders of magnitude, large entities will behave at rates far slower than small ones. As a result, a small entity will have completed its cycle of behavior before it can be affected directly by a change in the cycle of behavior of the large entity in which it is contained. They have become causally isolated and interact directly. For instance, take Brownian motion again of a dust particle, but now in the Atlantic Ocean. It is not causally affected by the Gulf Stream. That is to say, a dust particle continues to be pushed around randomly due to the heat motion of molecules, while in another frame of motion, it is also moving in the direction of the current. Likewise, humans cannot hear sounds above 30,000 hertz because the microscopic hairs on their auditory receptor cells cannot interact with frequencies of sound waves above that level. In sum, large entities interact with small entities contained in them indirectly by setting limits within which the small entities can behave. Within those limits, they can behave any way they want, so to speak. The existence of qualitatively different whole-part relations entails qualitatively different kinds of scale and top-down causation. And I should warn you that on this point I'm deviating from most of what is said in the literature. As we have just seen, the relation of physical composition or inclusion entails differences in physical scale between larger containing systems and smaller component subsystems. There is a top-down effect from large to small entities referred to as constraint or boundary condition. Such top-down effects are typical for entities that function in the physical mode. In the literature, physical top-down effects are applied universally, and this has caused problems because at every next level, and this is part of my thesis, at every next level up, a new kind of top-down cause is added to the existing ones. Let me explain that a second here with that same picture that you've seen before. What I mean to say here is that at the physical level of organization, you have physical top-down effects from large to small entities, but at the biological level, you have very different kinds of top-down effects. And I'll give you some concrete examples of that. For instance, the cells lining the fruit fly's intestine have a lifespan of about 7 days. Individual members of the fruit fly species last in the order of 8 weeks. And they provide initiating conditions for the population of fruit flies. The species, as a spatiotemporal phenomenon, may have a lifespan of several millions of years. Now, top-down causation in this case occurs in 2 steps, both of which involve the flow of genetic information rather than physical causation or physical interaction. For instance, the species itself has genetic boundary conditions for the reproduction of its members. Reproductive isolation is what the experts call it. But the species has no direct causal effect on the intestinal cells of individual members. Only the individual developing organism controls the differentiation of intestinal cells, and this involves the flow, again, of genetic information. Thus, we need to distinguish between a physical and a biotic form of top-down causation. In principle, we need to distinguish between as many kinds of scale and kinds of top-down causation as there are modes of functioning. I can't go into detail about that, it would take too much time. Each one of these is different from and added to the already existing scales of top-down constraints characteristic for lower-level entities. I'm sorry that this one it didn't work out as well as I had hoped, so you may have some difficulty seeing this. But let me explain. Here is the hierarchy of modes of functioning, and here are the various entities about which I am talking. And so what I'm saying is that any particular entity here functions in different modes, and that there are top-down types of causation from higher level modes to lower level modes, and that these are different. They have different characteristics depending on the kind of mode. So let me read some of these so you have an idea of what it says. For instance, let's take an elephant as an example. It has body parts that can be counted, so it functions in a numerical mode. It occupies space. It has momentum, so it functions in a physical way. It reproduces, so it functions in a biotic way, etc. Now, I had originally in my talk a piece about emergence, but because it has been covered already quite well by Marie-George and others, I'll just skip that. And if you have questions about it, feel free to ask those later. And I'll go on and now say a few things about the other hierarchy, or the other aspect of hierarchy, the specification hierarchy, the question of the relationship between different kinds of wholes. The emergence of novel entities requires ways of identifying novelty. The Dutch philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd and the German Jewish philosopher of biology Hans Jonas suggest that ignoring the boundary between any two qualitatively different modes of functioning, that is, applying epistemological reduction, results in self-contradiction. Self-contradiction can therefore be used as a diagnostic criterion. I will illustrate this criterion of excluded self-contradiction with their example of the boundary between the physical and the moral modes of functioning. According to Dooyeweerd and Jonas, then, the contradiction between moral freedom and natural causal determinism, known as Kant's third antinomy, is due to a denial of the boundary between mind and matter. If it is assumed that moral freedom characterizes the moral mode of functioning of people, and that causal determinism, in the classical sense, characterizes the material mode of functioning, then a self-contradiction arises when absolute mechanical causality is applied to moral functioning, because it leaves no room for human responsibility. The criterion of excluded self-contradiction then stipulates that there can be no contradiction between irreducible modes of functioning, unless a boundary is ignored. In this case, self-contradiction arises out of the failure to respect the boundary between the physical and the moral modes of functioning of human beings. This failure is demonstrated in the mistaken view that moral choice is causally determined. Similar arguments can be developed for distinguishing other modes of functioning. Let me just briefly give you some examples. Let's take the physical and the biotic mode of functioning. Normally a chemist would say that the reactants produce the product. You would not say that the reactants transmit characteristics to the products as its offspring. Then I'm confusing different kinds of categories, and that kind of confusion or self-contradiction is what is the diagnostic tool for telling you you're violating one of these boundaries. You might find this example a bit far-fetched, but actually when you read Bung, the philosopher of science, he does talk about products in chemical reactions inheriting characteristics, strangely enough. Similarly, it would be self-contradictory to say, for instance, that plants learn to make chlorophyll for the purpose of photosynthesis because plants have no intelligence or intentions as animals do. So this sort of reasoning distinguishes the biotic from the cognitive mode of functioning. And in this way we can identify physical, biotic, and cognitive functions as unique modes of functioning. I'm not saying that those are the only three that exist, they're just examples. There are then qualitatively different kinds of entities or wholes which function in qualitatively different ways. To develop this point, I distinguish entities from the ways they function, as I've just explained here. For instance, we experience an elephant as functioning in a variety of ways of modalities, and I won't repeat what I just said. There is also an order of succession in the ways things function. Any particular way is a necessary but insufficient condition for the possibility of the next way. So, for instance, to function spiritually requires inner awareness. Inner awareness requires perception. Perception requires life. Life requires matter. And matter requires motion, etc. This sequence of modalities defines what I would like to call the level structure of modes of functioning. The unique organization and behavior of an entity are characterized by the highest modality in which it functions actively, the so-called qualifying function. For instance, a pebble is qualified by its physical function, a plant by its biotic function, an animal by its perceptive functioning. Therefore, the succession of modes of functioning is also a level structure of qualifying functions, and that is what I refer to as a specification hierarchy, because it specifies the qualifying function of an entity. So from a synchronic perspective, we can define a specification hierarchy as a representation of series of different modes of functioning in order of generality. The order of succession of modes of functioning can be defined as an ontological relation between wholes as follows. So we have two wholes here, W1 and W2. W1 has a lower qualifying function than W2. If these two conditions are fulfilled, W1 is a necessary but insufficient condition for W2, and W2 is not necessary for the existence and proper function of W1. That sounds very abstract. It's actually very simple. Molecules are an insufficient but necessary condition for the existence of living things, but living things are not a necessary condition for the existence of molecules. Thus, the qualifying functions can be used to rank entities in a level structure of entities, with the succession of physical things, plants, animals, etc., as indicated here. So what is meant is that plants can be ranked at the level of the biotic mode of functioning, people at the level of the creedal mode of functioning, because they're spiritual beings, and animals in between at the level of perceptive or psychic functioning. Each level is a set which has all entities with the same qualifying function as its members. The level structure of entities and that of modes of functioning are abstract representations of the same ontological order. The specification hierarchy can also be interpreted from a diachronic perspective as a classification of qualitatively different modes of functioning that have emerged in succession from the physical mode in the process of evolution. Let's see, how much time do I have left?
Oh, we have half an hour.
Half an hour, okay. Good. Now I want to introduce a new distinction that's quite central to my point, and that is that wholes can become parts. Wholes can become parts. In the process of becoming a part, a whole acquires new properties, which we refer to as parts properties. And it retains properties it has as a whole. Examples, one that I've mentioned before, an isolated atom can become a molecular atom, and in the process its charge distribution changes and its line spectrum changes as well. Other example, nucleic acid has physical properties, but it also contains and transmits genetic information. Properties it has by virtue of being produced by a cell. Thus, a whole which has turned into a part has two kinds of properties. Those properties it retained from when it functioned as a whole, as well as parts properties, that is, properties imposed upon it by the whole of which it became a part. The difference between these two kinds of properties can be described with the distinction between active and passive functions of entities. A couple of examples again, and I'll use this as the background. A DNA molecule functions actively in the numerical mode of function, the spatial one, the kinetic one, and the physical one, as well as the physical one. That is to say, you can number its parts. It occupies space, and it has a particular spatial structure, and it interacts chemically. Another way of putting this is that DNA is subject to the laws of number, space, and interaction, physical interaction. But in a passive way, DNA also functions biotically or by the fact that it carries genetic information. Here's something that you're not used to. It functions socially by being used to identify criminals. And it functions economically by being used for the production of proteins. So in these examples, what I'm saying is that DNA also functions above the physical level, but not in an active way, in a passive way, because it's being used by other entities for particular purposes. That is to say that DNA has biotic, social, and economic properties because it has them passively by virtue of being used by wholes of a qualitatively different kinds. And those are the ones that I call parts properties. In sum, the active functions of a thing describe the properties it has by virtue of its own activities as a whole. Since these activities depend on nothing else, they define the whole. The passive functions of a thing describe the properties it has by virtue of the activities of other wholes. These are the parts properties. That is, passive functions define the difference between parts and wholes. This distinction can be restated using the notion of laws of nature. On the one hand, both wholes and parts are actively subject to the rules that hold for them up to the respective highest mode in which they function. And on the other hand, parts, but not wholes, are also passively subject to the rules for the whole of which they are a part. Now I come to the part where I'll describe some problems with level structures that you find in the literature, and I will argue that most of these problems can be resolved using the distinctions that I have made. Let's ignore the one on the right here and only look at these two. On the left you find a typical example of a very consistent level structure. It uses the same criterion throughout its construction. This is the one by Silk. It consistently uses physical composition or constitution. In such a hierarchy, any given entity is both a whole and a part, as I described in the beginning with my example of the triangles. It is a whole because it contains smaller entities as parts, and it is a part because it is contained in larger entities. They have a definite order, and so it's a very simple kind of representation. Now there appear to be at least three reasons for inconsistencies in hierarchies. And they are, and I'll discuss those briefly. One is that wholes are mistaken for parts. The second one is that different kinds of wholes are confused. And the third one is that abstract and concrete hierarchies are mixed up in the same hierarchy. So let's take confusion of parts and wholes first. And we'll go to the example over here. Bonner, the biologist, presented his level structure as a level structure of composition. That's the intent. But he confuses wholes with parts. A cell, for instance, can be a whole if it's a unicellular organism, but then it should be at this level of organization. And if it's a tissue cell, it's a part, because it's produced by the organism. So there is an ambiguity in this particular level structure. Likewise, a macromolecule can be a whole. If we think of macromolecules, as the chemists call them, macrocycles, not biomacromolecules, then they can exist independently of living things, but they can also be parts. If you talk about DNA as a macromolecule, it is the product of an organism. So two examples of confusion. Now you may think that this maybe are far-fetched examples, but the implications of mistaking a part for a whole are quite significant in my view. For instance, genes have been treated as molecular level wholes rather than cellular level parts. This was to legitimize the application to genes of thermodynamics, which requires genes to be homogeneously distributed, freely diffusible molecular wholes. Now, this can be true under some conditions, but otherwise genes or their activities are not free to diffuse throughout a population, for instance, because they're integrated parts of cells. So there you have a particular example of how the confusion can work out on the level of the design of theories. Further, if interpreted as level structures of evolutionary change or evolutionary lineage here, Bonner's system would be inconsistent because organs do not develop into organisms. And this inconsistency arises because instead of treating organs as parts, in this particular case, they're treated as wholes evolving into other wholes, another example of confusion. And sometimes a part is mistaken for a whole and treated as a hierarchy itself. This is the case in the so-called command hierarchy that I introduced in the table in the beginning. The relationship between a commander and his soldiers would seem to deserve a separate kind of hierarchy because soldiers are not contained in a commander. But the distinction between entities and their functions, as I've introduced it, I would argue, makes it possible to view an army as a social part with a specific function, just like factories, hospitals, and schools. Like other hierarchies, the social hierarchy is distinguished from other hierarchies by the social relations between its components. And the relation of authority and command, as in an army, is part of a spectrum of social relations that characterize the social functioning of people. In sum, the concept of a command hierarchy, is what I'm arguing, is superfluous because an army is a part produced by society. It's not a hierarchy by itself. To take a hierarchy as a whole, to take an army as a whole, is to confuse the product of a hierarchically organized entity, an army, for a hierarchy itself. That is to say, it's to confuse a part with a whole. Now, I think the main reason for the confusion of parts and wholes is that the physical whole-part relation is applied universally. This is one of the points of critique that I have. Physical inclusion overlooks the difference between part-whole relations, such as DNA in a cell or an organ in an organism. That part and then the difference between that and whole-whole relations, such as water molecules in a cell that are not integrated. Because both involve physical inclusion. The concept of physical inclusion doesn't distinguish between these two situations. And wholes end up looking like parts. But we can avoid this confusion. When a whole becomes a part, as I've argued, it undergoes changes while maintaining its identity. So we can tell parts and wholes apart. Moreover, these changes, or the changes that make it possible to identify a part as a product of a whole, depend on the kind of whole it is a part of. You know, wholes have physical parts, or I should say physical wholes have physical parts, biotic wholes have biotic parts, social wholes have social parts, etc. Thus, by distinguishing between wholes and parts, as well as between kinds of parts, we can avoid taking macromolecules as parts of cells and organisms evolving from organs. Likewise, we can distinguish a whole included in another whole, such as water in a cell, from a part included in another whole, such as DNA in a cell. And finally, we can avoid the use of parts, such as an army, as another source of hierarchy. Then I'll move on to my second source of confusion, the confusion between qualitatively different kinds of wholes. And here I will use Bonner's hierarchy again. Bonner's hierarchy is inconsistent also in that it does not take into account the qualitative difference between the way things function. You'll see that in this particular part of the hierarchy, because here, if you interpret this consistently as a hierarchy of composition, or constitution, you'll find that a social entity, the community, constitutes a physical entity, the surface of the earth. And this, of course, makes no sense. The surface of the earth is constituted by plates, drifting plates, that are constituted by other geological kinds of parts, etc. So there you have an example of the confusion of different kinds of wholes. What you actually see, if you take a look at the hierarchy as a whole, is that there is a biotic hierarchy that runs from cell to community inserted in a physical hierarchy that runs from elementary particles to atoms and then jumps to the Earth's surface, etc. Now, such qualitative differences between wholes and the way they function are acknowledged by another writer, Sewell Wright. The single biologist here will recognize the name. He's the father, or one of the fathers of population biology, Sewell Wright. And here is his hierarchy. Wright wanted to provide a subdivision of the field of biology based primarily on level of organization. He aimed at a classification of the biological sciences based on ranking entities according to the criteria of composition and complexity. On the left, you see the main hierarchy of physical entities. It is constructed on the basis of physical composition. Larger entities physically contain smaller entities. In the middle, you find a biological hierarchy, which, he says, may be looked upon as a continuation of the physicist's hierarchy, located on the left. And then the level structure of biological entities itself, again, has two branches. One, a social hierarchy, and another one, a hierarchy of classification. So it seems as if Sewell Wright has a clear notion of different ways of functioning of entities, because this is the reason why he splits up the hierarchy in different branches. But yet, he downplayed these discontinuities as differences in degree of integration by asserting that, quote, the universe as a whole is the all-inclusive organism. This is the well-known idea of the superorganism. And also, quote, the concept that organisms are composed of suborganisms has become one of the most significant principles of biology. This generalization forces him to homogenize relations between the entities in his cosmic organism. And homogenized relations differ in degree, but not in kind. This scenario ignores the differences between physical and biotic entities, such as the role of purpose and the flow of information through hereditary lineage. In sum, Wright cannot decide whether relationships between entities differ in kind or in degree. The consequences of ignoring the different ways in which entities function, again, are not trivial. For one, the notion of scale in the literature on hierarchy theory is limited to that of physical scale. And what we find in Sewell Wright is that physical scale ultimately becomes the distinguishing criterion for his various hierarchies, all of them together. But physical scale is a physical whole-part relation, and I have argued that whole-part relations take on different characters according to the different modes in which these entities function. Top-down causation in the physical universe is very different from that in the human body. A single physical whole-part relation cannot take account of this diversity of whole-part relations. A further complication of ignoring different kinds of whole appears in Wright's attempt to see the entire hierarchy, as you see it, including all its branches, as an evolutionary process, depicted here on the right-hand side. Sections of the level structure can be interpreted that way without a problem, and you'll find the appropriate interpretation on the right. But a crystal cannot be said to be descended from molecules, for instance, in the same sense that offspring descends from parents, nor are macromolecules the biological descendants of molecules or organisms from organs. One cannot say, as the philosopher Bung does, that a chemical product descends from the reactants. And now I'll move on to the third source of confusion. That is the combination of concrete and abstract hierarchies, as you see here on the left. In a level structure of classification, as the one there that I summarized from genus to kingdom, conceptual entities are related by the criterion of generality or logical subsumption. There is a relation of class inclusion or logical inclusion, but not of physical composition or evolutionary lineage. Surprisingly, Wright does not consider higher taxons as natural kinds. He does not consider them as entities. So this is very inconsistent. For Wright, evolutionary lineage does not extend beyond the species. So in sum, this is a conceptual system that doesn't at all belong in the concrete system of the rest of its hierarchy. So, what is the extent of the mix-up? Wholes are taken as parts, different types of wholes are confused, and concrete and abstract hierarchies are combined into one. What I've tried to do is to convince you that once the different modes of functioning of entities are in view, these problems disappear. Moreover, the distinction between active and passive functioning of entities makes it possible to interpret their products. For instance, here I need another example. I'll take the shell of a gastropod as an example here of a product of a living organism. And the distinction between active and passive functions makes it possible to see shells and other kinds of products of organisms like nests of birds, DNA and protein fibers as products of living things. Humans produce abstract ideas, societies produce armies, and when you treat them as products of entities functioning in different ways, then I think you can solve the problem of where to fit these sorts of things, shells, nests, etc., in a hierarchy of physical composition. Since shells and nests are not themselves physically included in an organism. Even though a shell is not alive, you can argue that it passively obeys the laws of biology. And this is why the picture is here, because it demonstrates that there is a genetic mutation that will determine on which side the opening of the shell appears. And so that's an example of the idea that it does, even though it's a physical object, obey the laws of biology. Further, in the hierarchy of specification, abstract systems, such as Wright's level system of classification that didn't belong, are viewed as cultural products of concrete beings who can function in the mental mode. This clarifies the relation between concrete and abstract systems. And social authority structures, such as an army or a factory, do not require separate representation in a different kind of hierarchy when seen as social products. The key to these solutions is the distinction between active and passive functions. Products are not only directly subject to the rules of their own lower level mode of functioning, they are also indirectly subject to the rules for the higher level subject that produces them. Like any other part, a shell obeys the law of physics when it falls, as well as the laws of biology when it inherits its handedness. To conclude then, the confusion of parts and wholes, as well as of different kinds of whole, can be removed, I suggest, with the definitions proposed. But there are other problems, and here I will complete my presentation with saying something about the religious dimensions of systems theory. Historically, hierarchy theory is an attempt to characterize the cosmic order. In the 19th century, it was transformed into something known as organicism and then systems philosophy, in an attempt to develop an alternative to both mechanicism and vitalism. The engagement of these movements with religious considerations was complex. Vitalism, for instance, enjoyed empirical support for some time and was also welcomed in religious circles because it could be used to maintain space for divine action in the world. Later, the anti-reductionistic intent of systems philosophy was welcome from a religious perspective because it created space for what we would now refer to as the spiritual dimension of human life. More generally, in focusing on the role of boundaries between modes of functioning, systems philosophy also emphasized the limitations of the disciplines that study these modes. This made it credible to insist on the boundaries of scientific knowledge as compared with other forms of knowledge, including religious knowledge. Further, complementarity as one of the possible relationships between religious and scientific knowledge became popular in systems philosophy, where it described the relationship between any two modes of functioning. These developments received a religious interpretation in the philosophy of Herman Doiwit, the one I mentioned before, the Dutch philosopher. Specifically, he interpreted the existence of irreducible modes of functioning as a manifestation of a divinely created diversity. I refer to this philosophy as an interpretation of the doctrine of creation, rather than a deduction from it, because one does not have to be a Christian, in my view, in order to acknowledge that the multimodal hierarchy is an empirically promising ontology. But it is an ontology with religious implications. This is manifest in current debates among Christian scholars about the unity of wholes in hierarchies. And this is a topic that we've heard about before from Mary George. Does this unity lie in the material organization of their parts, as argued by organicists, or in an immaterial substance? Are wholes material systems or immaterial substances? Christians who take the substance view argue that the systems view cannot account for a long list of things. And I'll just mention them here because Marie discussed them in more detail this morning. What I'm referring to is the individual identity of an organism, the personal identity of a human being, the subjectivity of human experience, the motivation of human action by reasons as final causes, and the life of the soul after death, and finally the existence of God as an immaterial being. If you find the arguments for the substance view convincing, as I do in some ways, you can interpret wholes dualistically as substances, and a hierarchical order of the cosmos as a manifestation of the nature of these substances. Christians who take the material systems view tend to be non-reductive physicalists. They point out that the notion of substance has its own problems. If substance is taken to underwrite the unity of a whole, then parts qualify as parts of the whole only if they have the same substance. And I'm talking here about the example that you see on the screen there. But they argue shells and nests and extracellular fibers and DNA and many more products of living things are not the same substance in that they are not alive. In response, I have suggested that the unity of such wholes, including their products, can be underwritten by the notion of natural law. I think such products of living things could still be subsumed under the notion of substance by interpreting natural law as grounded in the nature of the substance. J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray, two American philosophers, argue that there is a far more formidable problem with the notion of substance, and that is how to conceive of evolutionary change. The notion of substance, according to them, sets limits to change. How can one can conceive of, say, embryonic development and metamorphosis as change grounded in the potential capacities of a substance, but, and I quote, if the organism goes beyond the boundaries of such a change, say, if a caterpillar turned into a fish, we would not say that the caterpillar still exists as a fish. Rather, we would say that the caterpillar ceased to be and the fish came to be. This is a quote from Moreland and Ray. According to another philosopher of biology and a Christian, Laporte, the same applies to biological speciation. In his opinion, no current account of species can tolerate the essentialism associated with the notion of substance. Now, I suggest that Moreland and Ray and Laporte are offering a Platonic reading of Aristotle's notion of substance. That is not true to Aristotle, who believed at least that organisms could emerge from matter. Of course, he didn't have reasons to think about problems of evolution, but the idea that organisms can emerge from matter involves substantially enough change that his notion of substance must be allowing for that. So both substance dualists, and this in conclusion, and non-reductive physicalists have offered convincing interpretations even of relevant scripture passages about questions related to the soul as a substance. There is a book by John Cooper who will argue in favor of dualism, and another one by Joel Green who will argue for a non-reductive physicalist view of the soul, and both of them can support their position with scripture passages, which in my view goes to show that scripture was not intended to answer this question. So I shall leave you with this unresolved tension in biology, because I don't have an answer either. However, there is agreement that the order of nature is stratified, I have tried to convince you that the specification hierarchy is the single interpretation of this stratified order that is consistent and deserves to be considered as a presupposition about the order of nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes. We can take some questions. So, eventually it would be good
because in the near future probably there will be some problems in philosophy of biology or in biology itself and in medicine, and so with the definition of individuals related to the problem of parts and wholes, especially with the hybrids, and the problem of chimeras, also or microchimeration, for example, where you have new stem cells which are injected in individuals, and so those are new parts, or you can take them because they are not produced by the whole, by another whole actually, no? And you have also endosymbiosis with Lynn Margulis' argument about the problem of the status, ontological status of mitochondria, of plastids, chloroplasts, and so actually they are inserted, engulfed in an organism and take part of the organism. Those are two organisms which make one. You see, the problems are coming there also for sexual reproduction with two. You have all those problems are taken also now, especially in the near future. There will be also the definition of those things. Even we have intestinal flora. So it is me or not me. So you see those kind of problems we can have. I do not know.
Yeah, I take that as a suggestion. I wouldn't have an answer right now, but you certainly point your finger on a very difficult problem. I'm very familiar with that. So you're right.
questions and comments.
I enjoyed your talk, and I certainly agree with you that these different modes give a good classification of the order that we find. But you do stress the discontinuities that we have among the various modes. And I wonder, how do you get across those discontinuities when you have emergence? Earlier on you mentioned that moral choices are not causally determined. I presume you mean not physically
That's what
determined.
I meant, yes, in the classical sense.
You're against hard determinism, but not necessarily soft determinism, right?
Not necessarily, no.
Right. And in your diagram of man, you had the brain and the body. Where is the mind? Or is that the same as the brain? Because the big jump,
yes,
as I see it, is to get to the social aspects, to get beyond the physical laws of what is, to the other laws, the oughts, if you like, of moral laws and rationality. How do you get beyond that jump? Because it seems to me that emergence just doesn't do it.
No, well, all I can say is that what you find in the literature and what I can offer you is speculation, because there is no good empirical evidence for examples of emergence. I agree, for instance, with Mary George that real examples of emergence are very hard to come by. The best thing that I can come up with is, for example, is about the emergence, let's say, or the attempt to understand the boundary between non-life and life, matter and life. There have been different attempts to conceive of that. At first, historically, it was in terms of how can you think of the change in terms of proteins that can carry genetic information. That was replaced by nucleic acids. And a couple of years ago, there was a publication in which the attention was redirected to proteins again. One of the problems there is that organisms have all left-turning, left-rotating, optically rotating proteins, for instance. And when you do the protein synthesis in the test tube, you get a racemate. You get 50% left and right rotating. So this is a difficult problem to explain. How do you explain this? Well, in the experiment that I'm referring to, I can't quite remember the name of the author, but the experiment consisted of using a left rotating protein as an enzyme, and to offer it a mixture of 50-50% left and right rotating amino acids, and it would catalyze only the synthesis of its own left-handedness. And you could even build in a right rotated amino acid in a left rotating protein, and it would remove and correct the mistake, as it were. So there you have a system in which a protein functions, as it were, with a memory, and even with an error correcting kind of characteristic. Now, this was an experiment, so it has been constructed to do this sort of thing, and it's far removed from any kind of natural process of emergence that would bridge the boundary. So all I can say to you is, at that level, matter to life, it's extremely speculative. It is even more speculative when you go from life to mind, etc.